Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for our fourth episode of Real Relationships. This is our podcast with the Domestic Abuse Project of Delaware County. My name is Veronica Lynch, and I am the Outreach Awareness Specialist, and I am joined by our incredible intern.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ania, and I'm a senior at Newman University.
Awesome. And today we have a really great guest, and we're really excited to have the conversation. And I will let her introduce herself and, tell us a little bit about your career, your background, and anything that you want people to know about you.
Yeah, well, thanks, Veronica and Ania. I'm so excited to be part of this podcast, and I'm looking forward to talking to you. And I just want to upfront say I'm in no means an expert on the topic of domestic violence. I don't formally research it. I don't live it day in and day out as a career. But I think I want to share three things about me that may explain to your listeners why you're talking to me today.
Right.
And the first is that I work in healthcare. So I started my career as a healthcare attorney and now work in healthcare policy and advocacy. And in my day job, I lead the American Hospital Association's work in a variety of different areas, including how we can make healthcare more affordable, valuable, and accessible. I also lead our work around what hospitals are doing outside of their four walls to improve the health of their communities. And this includes a lot of work around what we call the societal factors that influence health. And one of the things that we're seeing a number of hospitals take on and do now is to screen individuals for domestic violence when they show up at the hospital. So doing a lot of work around that increased screening and making sure that hospital clinicians working at hospitals have the tools that they need to feel comfortable asking the questions and places to refer individuals when they have been screened for domestic violence. Second, I'm a survivor of domestic violence. And ending a mentally and physically abusive relationship is really the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And 14 years later, it's still hard to really share the specifics of my relationship, but I am working to find my voice in this space, in this conversation, and to be able to use my experience to help move the needle forward and eliminate domestic violence in the future. And especially in my community, the South Asian community, which brings me to my third piece that I want to share with you is that I'm South Asian, and specifically Indian. And before we get started, I just want to spend a quick second talking about who we mean when we say South Asian. So right now, Indians make up more than 80% of the South Asians in the United States, but the term South Asian includes individuals from Bangladesh, Bhutan, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. So it is much broader than just the subcontinent of India. And all of these groups share some of the same cultural elements that lead to higher rates of domestic violence. And the last thing I want to say is, while both men and women can be victims of domestic violence in the South Asian community, it's far more common that women are victims. So as we talk today, I'll be focused on that aspect.
Awesome. Well, all of that sounds great. And I forgot, I didn't say your name at the beginning, but Priya, thank you so much for joining us today. And you brought up two things, like just in your intro alone, that I think are like really relevant to even our agency at DAP. And that was like the healthcare screenings was the first one. That's actually a service that we do provide in the community education outreach department. That would either be me or Nicole Powell, who was like on our podcast as well. We would actually do provide that education. So if anyone's listening and they are a healthcare provider and they would like to have that, you can always reach out to us and we will set up that, whether it's a one-on-one meeting and lesson, or we can come and speak for in a class setting, and we can come and do everyone at one time, all of that. So thank you for bringing that up, because that is a service that we do provide and something that isn't commonly asked of us. So and the second thing, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I think it's so important that you're providing that, because when we talk with healthcare providers, like their number one concern is their fear in having conversations around these issues, right? And so having that education will help lower that fear and allow for more issue spotting and finding cases and getting individuals the support that they need. So I think that's awesome.
Thank you. And the second thing was that you mentioned the specifics of like what the South Asian community is, and I appreciate you bringing that up, because that's something I've never heard before. So I think that's really important. And also disclaimer, Ania and I are not experts as well. We do this, this is our job and like this is what we do, but we are always learning, and we love we're open for feedback and always like listening and being growing and with everyone who's involved in this with us. So thank you for that. So I'm really excited to get into this conversation, and our first topic you brought up a little bit in your introduction. And for everyone listening, I do recommend that you check out Priya's article that she wrote, which is called Domestic Violence in the South Asian Community is Rising During the Pandemic. And you gave steps on how people can help during this time as well. And in that article, you stated that the South Asian community faces higher rates of domestic violence due to cultural elements. And you brought that up a little bit today. So can we start with one of the first ones? And I think in the article you mentioned was the stigma of divorce.
Yeah, so definitely. And before I jump into sort of this concept around divorce, I just want to talk a little bit more about the data in the South Asian community, just to show
please. What
a problem it is. So the cultural elements really keep the South Asian community from identifying abuse and seeking help around the abuse, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that after generation where people aren't talking about these things, people aren't getting out of these situations, it becomes a problem that's perpetuated from generation to generation. Right. So there are a number of surveys that have been conducted. There are two that are sort of leading the way, one from University of Wyoming and one from the University of California, that found that 40% of South Asian women surveyed had some form of intimate partner violence in their life. And organizations like DAP, but that are focused on the South Asian community, have estimated that number is even higher. So it is a significant problem, and it is happening at a rate that is higher than in other communities. And so like other cultures, South Asian victims face the same feelings of shame and guilt that are often associated with domestic violence. As with a lot of other minority cultures, there's social and language barriers that may keep individuals from seeking help or knowing where to go for help. But there are those that are more unique cultural elements. And the first one is the stigma associated with divorce. I think women, especially in the South Asian community, have a huge pressure to balance family values and maintain their family's reputation within the community, whether that's their spouse and any children they have in that immediate family, or if it's the reputation of their parents or their grandparents. So in our community, it's seen as off limits to talk against your spouse, right? It's considered just bad etiquette. You don't do it, right? You don't air that dirty laundry outside of the four walls of your home. There's also just a lot of stigma associated with divorce. So oftentimes a fear of a marriage falling apart or how it will look to the outside is a huge barrier to reporting abuse or seeking help. There's also legitimately the fear of losing their children, which complicates that further. And I can just tell you, I was not married to my abuser, but I was engaged to him. And there was even a huge stigma associated with calling off an engagement. And even though calling off that wedding was sort of the hardest and bravest thing I've ever had to do in my life, in my community, a lot of people view it as a problem with me, or that there's a character flaw with me that I called off a wedding, rather than looking at his actions or what led to the engagement being called off. So there really is that stigma with ending these relationships and the constant pressure to make sure that if you're in a relationship, you make it work. Right. And if you're not making it work on the inside, that at least it looks like it's working on the outside. And so I can't tell you, the number of guys since I called off my engagement that have said, well, I'm not sure my parents are going to be okay with you having a broken engagement.
Wow.
And it's so crazy and it's so old fashioned. But I think that it's still there, and it makes it really hard for women in our community to speak up or walk away.
Yeah. And something that we've talked about like on this podcast, and we talk about with our job all the time with education, is the influence of gender roles. And that kind of, I feel like, came up a little bit in this point, is that, not only, right, it seems as though like the blame is being put onto like you as a woman as well. Like you said, there's no question of his actions and like what was done. Do you think that plays a role in things like how we view gender, or like what role gender plays in the South Asian community?
Yeah, I mean, I think it plays a huge role. And the South Asian culture is predominantly patriarchal. So we're in this culture where people think that girls are born simply to be fed throughout their lives, right? And boys are born to sort of earn money and support the whole family. And those gender roles sort of evade everything that happens in our day-to-day lives. So in a lot of cases, because of those roles, there's that financial dependency on husbands or families, or the male partner, which makes it hard to leave an abusive situation, right? Women also are expected to play certain roles in our community that includes sort of keeping the peace at home, not rocking the boat, protecting the family's honor, right? And again, that goes back to some of the reputational things that I talked about already. And so obviously we're in 2021 and we see some of this changing. We see, double working households, more women as breadwinners. But in some cases, I think personally, and I haven't seen research on this, but I do feel like those changes for our culture are bringing about insecurities that sort of challenge this idea of patriarchy and challenge the idea of the role that men are supposed to play in families. And it's almost leading to more abuse in the sense that there's a lot of insecurities that are playing out when, women take on some of the roles that historically men have had. And so I think as families change, some of these older ideas are still lingering below the surface. And, our generation and the generation after us are really going to have to work through these issues.
And do you think these are issues? Oh, sorry, Annie, I didn't mean to cut you off. Oh, you can go right.
Okay.
I was just saying, do you think these are issues that we can solve through conversations, or how can we what have you noticed is the best way to combat this?
So I think conversation is huge, and I think awareness is huge too, right? So the more we can talk about these issues within the South Asian community and have truly open and trusted conversations, I think the more we're going to move towards this. But I do think some of it just changes by nature of time, right? So if, we go from a culture where women never worked to having 2 or 3 generations where women are equal breadwinners to men, those families are going to figure out how they need to function and how they need to thrive. And I think their kids seeing how they function and how they thrive then trains another generation on moving us a little bit further. And so I think some of those gender roles will just take time to sort of play out and see how they work.
Everything that I read, I was like, wow, this is really true. And then when you were saying in the South Asian community, sometimes the wife's job is to, keep the peace and make it seem like everything's going great, when on the inside, it might not be going so great. And it's just wow, that just can be so much pressure, especially if there's kids involved. And if you have, other different priorities that you have to take. I just really appreciate actually hearing it from somebody that comes from this culture. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
And I think that brings up a great point too. And you brought up the pressure of living up to these expectations for both men and women. So, and that leads to insecurities. Do you think that pressure for women, is put on them largely a lot of the times, the pressure to keep the home together and everything like that? You brought that up with honor as well.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think more generally, I think it is reflected on both men and women in our culture. We are often referred to as the model minority, right? Are you familiar with that term?
No, I haven't.
No, yeah, I haven't either.
So it's this myth that South Asians are successful economically, and yet they've managed to retain all of their strong cultural values at home.
Okay.
So for South Asians that immigrated to the United States as professionals, like my parents did in the 60s, there was a lot of pressure on them to sort of maintain that perfect model minority status. And a lot of them at the time, and you may hear this come up in racial justice conversations, but a lot of them worked to sort of distance themselves from other minorities who they may have deemed sort of a lower status in order to preserve their own standing, right? So to be in the place they wanted to be in the social hierarchy, they had to preserve this idea of perfection, right? This idea of good family values, strong family ties, that you're very successful. And when you're trying to maintain all of those things, you don't talk about things like the rampant domestic violence in your community, right? You don't want to portray your community in a negative way. It's got to be all of the positive stuff. And so you start denying that violence is happening, and you start silencing the voices of those that are raising issues around domestic violence. And so we see a lot of that pressure put on men and women within our community to put it in.
Wow, I think that's great information to share. And you kind of that brings up what you were saying in the article as well. Is with immigration, you have this social isolation, and you might, we said, with language barriers and feeling as if maybe we also just don't know what services are available. So I guess and that's a big thing that we're really trying to highlight over the next couple of months is what are the barriers to accessing services and how can we help get rid of those. And I think that this is a great conversation to have. Not only is this Ania and I are already learning so much through this, and I hope everyone listening also learns, and, other agencies as well, to see these are things when we're helping our clients and we're serving everyone in every community, we do have to keep these things in mind and understand where people are coming from and how we can meet them where they're at. So I think this is great information.
Yeah, and Veronica, sorry.
No worries.
But you talked a little bit about immigration-related social isolation, and I just want to take a second to point that out. Many times women come here because they marry a man that lives in the United States. And so they often have a higher level of isolation because they don't have family here.
Right.
Or if they do, it's their husband's family. It's not their family. They aren't necessarily given the same opportunities to build social networks or contacts or people that they can turn to for support. And a lot of times they're not financially independent. They aren't geographically mobile. They don't have cars. They can't move and go where they want to go. And then the biggest factor, a lot of times they may not have legal status to stay in the United States. And their ability to stay here is tied to their marriage, which then makes it really challenging to say, I'm being abused. My marriage isn't working. I want out, because they have come here and they're alone. And so it just creates a huge challenge and barrier to seeking help.
Definitely. And I know, Ania, you spent a lot of time doing the research just specifically about immigration and domestic violence. Did you notice, did anything stand out to you in that research?
Exactly what Priya just said. I think knowing that women come over here, with another, American, and they are basically the love of their life, and then something happens, it's wow, I have no resources because I'm not from here. You know what I mean? I don't know the laws. And then another thing that really stood out to me was that sometimes in the South Asian community, those laws are different from our American laws. And I was like, wow. So it was different. Once I really looked at it, it was like, okay, even if they do come and get help from here, it may be different from if they go back to their hometown. And I was like, that must be really hard for, anybody going through that, especially with kids involved, because I know I read a lot of the time, women don't do that because they don't want to be separated from their children. And sometimes that's the force, that's the force that happens. If they do say something, there is a chance they might get separated from their family. I'd rather stay with my kids. So that's,
and I just think about, I'm a lawyer, right? I practice law, and I think that if I needed to find an immigration lawyer, it would feel like a hard thing to do, right? I wouldn't know the right place to go, and I'm a lawyer, okay? So I can only imagine how hard it feels for someone who comes here. English is their second language. They may not speak it fluently. They may not have access necessarily to internet access all the time to look up things or find out information on where they can go for help. They may not be going to doctor's appointments by themselves. So when they are screened, they're not able to answer those questions honestly. They might not have access to all of these things that I think, I take for granted. And certainly my experience with domestic violence was very different because I had those things that I could reach out to and rely upon. And so I just think about it, and it just, to think about how lonely these women must feel and how they feel trapped and can't get out. It's heartbreaking.
And especially I'm thinking about, my experience. I cover the hotline sometimes, and, we get calls from everyone, and I think what you said really just rings, it like hits home a little bit, especially if we don't cover immigration with our agency, but we do refer out, we can give services and we are aware of the local services. But like you said, if you don't have the internet, right, like, and I'm giving you like another phone number to have to call. And if you've had to call again and again, and like you said, like maybe this time they don't have, like, we're lucky we have translation lines, so we can speak to, any language. We can, work with it and make sure that we still provide the information that we have, but not every agency has that. So I think that you're really, you're highlighting some true problems. Like, we can't say that we are inclusive and that we serve each community if we're not doing the bare minimum to make sure that people can get the information that they need if we can't help them.
Yeah, and it became really challenging during COVID too, right?
Yeah.
Like the access points, a lot of them suddenly went away because we went into this virtual world. And if a woman is now at home, locked down with their abuser, they're no longer leaving the house to maybe go to work or go to school or take their kids somewhere. They're not interacting with people outside of their home. They're just trapped at home with their abusers. And in some cases, they have limited access to the internet. They have a limited access to a phone. So if they're calling a hotline and someone's not there to help them right when they call, you might not be able to get a hold of them again because you can't call them back on that phone that belongs to the abuser. And so I think that there are just a lot of logistical issues that, community-based organizations that are dealing with this have to sort of be cognizant of, and when you're building your programs, take into account.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I feel like the assumption that when we went into COVID was that everybody had a computer that has a camera and you can Zoom in. And that also implies that you have a space that's quiet and that no one's going to like walk in. So, I mean, you're absolutely true, especially like you're saying, if someone calls hotline and that you don't, and like maybe you can't leave a message with the callback number. And, with the way that's just how, I feel like you're highlighting some true issues here. And these are things that go just beyond, a DV agency, a suicide hotline, everything. And, there are great action steps for places to be taking as well. If we don't already have these systems in place, what are we doing to make sure that we fix it and put them in place for the future?
Yeah, and we see it more broadly in healthcare, to your point, Veronica. Like it's beyond domestic violence, it's healthcare in general, right? So when the pandemic hit and we switched to predominantly virtual care, there are 30 million Americans that don't have access to broadband internet.
Right.
So how are they going to access telehealth? And then if you look at rural communities specifically, 24% of individuals living in a rural community only have cell phones. They don't have smartphones. So no broadband in a lot of places, no smartphones. How can they access healthcare? How can they access an organization like yours when they don't have those things? And it's a real challenge. And so, we've been talking a lot about digital health equity and what are the steps that we can take to ensure that, everyone in America has broadband access. It's crazy to me that we live in this country and not everyone has the same access to the internet. So those are just some of the things that I think we're looking at more broadly in healthcare, but they apply here as well.
Absolutely. Definitely. I mean, you think about, all the kids in school too. It applies to, way beyond this. And it's sad that it takes a pandemic to get people to realize that these are basic things that we should have been thinking about. But I'm glad the conversations are are happening now. But, did it need to take an actual natural disaster for that to take place? And I guess the last point, we did touch on this a little bit before, but I also wanted to talk a bit about the hotline. So we can talk about this and then get into hotline information. But the last one was that concept of honor being a cultural aspect that leads to more domestic violence. Did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yeah. And I think the honor really goes back to sort of that reputation, right? How do we keep the reputation of our family safe within the community? And I think that as we move forward, we just really need to keep challenging that idea of honor and what actually is honorable, right? And this is my opinion, right? Is honor having a family that looks perfect on the outside but has abuse taking place on the inside? I don't think that is the definition of honor. And so I think the more conversations we can have in our community to raise awareness that this is happening, to make it okay to talk about it and to disclose it and to come together around developing solutions, the more I think we can sort of change that definition of what honor may in fact be for our community, and decrease domestic violence at the same time.
That's a great point. Thank you. So, right, we touched on this a little bit before, is like having access to hotlines. And in the article, you mentioned that there was a 50% decrease for at the hotline mentioned. And I don't want to get it wrong how to say it. You listed a couple of different agencies. One was in New Jersey as well. So do you want to touch on those agencies, and then we can kind of compare it to our experience here at DAP too?
Yeah, that would be great. And Veronica, we touched on some of the challenges that happened during the pandemic, right? The lockdowns, the lack of ability to make phone calls, to use the internet, and all of those things. And so at the beginning of the pandemic, the number of calls to DV hotlines across the country dropped by as much as 50% in some regions. So Sucky, which is a DV organization serving the South Asian community in New York City, they saw a 53% decline in their calls between February and March of 2020 as the COVID cases across New York City soared. And as the stay-at-home restrictions were lifted, their calls began to rise again. So they reported that the call volumes between April and June exceeded their pre-pandemic levels. And that's what we're seeing from all of the South Asian organizations that have been reporting out this data. There's another organization, Narika, which is based out of Fremont, California, that provides services to domestic violence survivors in the South Asian community. And they witnessed a spike of 3 times the calls post-lockdown. So we're seeing like them jump from 3 to 4 times. And then Manavi, which is based in New Jersey, close to you all, they were actually the first South Asian women's rights organization in the country. And they came about in the 80s. And they were seeing an increase of calls, and their reports not only show an increase of calls after the lockdowns were over, but they showed an increase in the forms of abuse. They were more intense and more severe than they had been pre-pandemic. And I think that makes sense when you think of all the stress that all of us were under when our worlds completely changed because of the pandemic.
Right. At the beginning.
What are you guys seeing?
Yeah. So at the beginning, our numbers were around like 30% decrease in calls. So we went from having the phone ring like all the time to maybe getting 4 calls a day. And, they were specific. Most of the calls were still specific to like obtaining a protection from abuse order or, safety planning. And we did notice some of the same things that you brought up, especially with the forms of abuse. Things were more specific in that it was like medical abuse and manipulation, not letting people, really honing on people's fears of getting sick, not letting people use hand sanitizer or hiding medication, and not letting, letting them know if they leave the house, they're going to get sick, or purposely leaving the home and possibly bringing COVID back in as a form of like, a scare tactic to keep people afraid all the time. And when we came back, we did notice an increase in calls once restrictions were uplifted. And it also helps because we can also have people come into the office again. So we are able to meet with people if they can't access our hotline. We are open to walk-ins. So if people they need us right then and there, they can come to our office, and we're like operating. All our services are back up. So we can, do court accompaniment. We can help with PFAs. Things are still being done over Zoom, such as counseling if people need it, but they also have the option to come here if they can't do counseling at home. So they can come here and we'll do it with them in the office. So we did notice a decrease, and now covering the hotline, I do notice that the calls compared to this time last year are a lot higher, because maybe before I was in a 4-hour shift, I was getting 1 call, and now it's like back up to maybe, 2 an hour. And some of them don't have anything to do with us, but, we're still happy to talk to them on the phone. But, it's definitely, we saw like a nationwide kind of decrease and then increase again. So it's interesting to see those numbers compare and how our experiences compare as well. But when you think about, like you said, the rates being higher in the South Asian community, then looking at the huge decrease, like 50% is a huge decrease. And then having what you said, 3 times that of their pre-pandemic numbers, like that's insane.
Yeah, it is. And Oh, sorry,
Oh,
Ania.
go ahead.
I was just gonna say, like, being trained with Veronica, so I trained with Veronica on Hotline. And this time last year, I think it was like my first time being on Hotline, and me and Veronica were sitting, and she's
Yeah.
like, it's not usually like this. And I'm like, oh my God, okay. And then we got like maybe 2 or 3 calls. And like Veronica said, some of them were like, for referred out. And one was like maybe, for like a PFA or something like that. And then we were just talking about it. And I was longer. Veronica was like, oh yeah, my phone's ringing. And I'm like, okay, good.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, some days I get nothing but calls, and they're intense, and like where there's a lot of safety planning or shelter referrals involved. And then some days it's just people trying to find our Facebook lives, and I'll be like, it's on Facebook, so I'm clicking through and helping them get to Facebook through the hotline. So
Well, I just think it's so interesting, and I'm learning a lot from talking with both of you as well. But like, I never thought about using COVID as sort of a mental abuse or a way of physical abuse, right? Like, I never thought about withholding hand sanitizer as a form of abuse, but it is. Like, I think about how much I relied on hand sanitizer and had to have it everywhere I went, especially at the beginning of the pandemic when we didn't know if COVID was spread on surfaces, right? And so I can only imagine sort of the mental impact that can have to have that, be kept from you, or to have someone go outside the house and come in and bring COVID into your house. So that is just new levels I had never thought about.
Right. And then, another is if we think about those who might have disabilities or like medical conditions, where at the time, like the beginning of COVID, it was really just like drilled into us that was a community that could only get sick, right? Like when it was really downplayed, everyone said it was like older people and, people who have underlying medical conditions. And then this is before it was even talked about that we could be passing it with no symptoms. And so there's this constant fear of just getting sick in general. And then you add on the power and control tactics that you might be experiencing every day. And now COVID's impacting it. And when we think about the cycle of abuse as well, with that tension building phase, which would be when things start to change, or their tension, that could be financial burdens, which we saw the unemployment rates went out through the roof and everyone was having to file for unemployment. That plays a huge part in it as well. So everything really just got amplified and people were just pushed into like this situation where we're all unprepared. So it was a huge learning curve for us as well. When people are calling for safety planning ideas, we're learning with them because we've also never experienced this. So it was, it's unprecedented time. So it was definitely scary for everyone. We want to make sure that the services that we're providing are the most up to date and they're the most productive and helpful. But how do we do that when we've never dealt with this before?
Yeah. So did you guys adopt anything specifically to do more proactive outreach when people weren't able to call in on the hotlines? Like, was there a way you were able to reach them?
Yeah. So with our department and like specifically, we really just went full force into social media because that's where we had our biggest like platform. So we did like our Facebook lives and we were allowing people to connect with us. Usually we don't recommend that people connect with us through Facebook or Instagram messages because it's not confidential. We can't promise the confidentiality of that as we can with our hotline. But we also understood that is the only option at this point if you can't talk. So we did like have that be open. And if we couldn't take the calls, we were also referring out to the National Domestic Violence Hotline because they have a chat option. So if people couldn't make calls, you can chat on their website. So we were always providing as many resources as we could on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter so that people knew if they like looked us up that if we can't help them, we were giving them places that we thought would be best. So we've been doing a lot of Facebook Live stuff and then working with community partners such as healthcare providers and law enforcement, because we did, while the hotline noticed a decrease, the law enforcement noticed an increase in calls. And that was because we know that the violence is reaching its peak. So they were, a lot of the first contact a lot of times. So really creating those strong partnerships with our community members as well.
Yeah, I will definitely agree with that. I would say with our department, the internet, social media has been our voice. We have gotten so creative with like Facebook Lives. We have done panelings. Like last month, we did information on the Native Americans. Now this month, we're doing the South Asian community. So we are really pushing out there to just get everybody to know more about us, like what we offer, and just to educate them. Like this is an education purpose for me and Veronica. Like she said, we're learning so much, and we're not experts on this, so it's good to have somebody from the community just come and talk to us. So social media has really been our platform.
Definitely.
That's awesome.
Yeah. Never thought I would have a job that did Facebook Lives, and now it's like, oh, you know, and we love doing it. It's tons of fun. And like this podcast is something that came out of COVID because we started doing the Facebook Lives and then we got to do the podcast. So it's been great. It's just been a huge learning curve. But we like
TikToks.
Yeah, we have a TikTok now.
That's awesome.
We did that. What else did we do? We had like a couple just specific campaigns, things like that.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Ania, would you like to ask our next question?
Okay, so I know we touched on this a little bit before, but we discussed some of the elements that increase the domestic violence. So what about the elements act as barriers to accessing some services for people of the South Asian community?
Yeah, so I think we covered a lot of some of the barriers to why in the South Asian community folks aren't accessing services. So I think I want to talk about this one a little bit from the healthcare perspective. You know, oftentimes individuals come into a clinic or a hospital seeking help for domestic violence, and that gives doctors and nurses and others within the healthcare system sort of this huge opportunity to engage and intervene. But during the pandemic, a lot of those places closed down. Everything was virtual, as we talked about. And so individuals weren't able to show up at those places in the same way that they would have before. And it became a really big barrier. It also became a barrier in the way that clinicians could provide trauma-informed care, right? So as we turn to telehealth, and we talked about the people that don't have access to it, but for the people that do have access to it, you can't really answer the same questions or create that environment of trust when an abuser is sitting on the other side of the room or in another room within the house, or you don't know when they're going to show up. They're also with trauma-informed care, another key piece is around educating and allowing time for discussion. And when we went to this virtual world, you know, visits got shorter. And a lot of times, from just a practical standpoint, people lost time from the medical visit because they were figuring out technology. It took 10 minutes to dial in, 15 minutes to dial in, right? And so you have less time to provide that education and discussion with individuals that you're talking with. And then I think providing translation services and culturally competent care became a lot harder during the pandemic as well. And then, you know, we talked about some of the other factors, especially the cultural issues, and then the access to broadband and smartphones and all of those things. So, I mean, when you put all of that on top of each other, I think it just became a very challenging time to seek help and to say, I need help.
Yeah. Yeah, especially when you think about when all the conversations were like, you know, here's how we handle working from home all the time and like Zoom fatigue. And yeah, right, it is tiring, you know, to be on your computer all the time, but that's not thinking of any of the other layers that you brought up where violence can be happening. So imagine Zoom fatigue as well as fear. And, you know, wondering when's the next time you're going to see your family again, or wondering if you're going to make it to see your family again. So I think, especially these are things that when we have these conversations, we can't just be thinking of the population that isn't being affected by any of these issues as well. We have to be thinking of everyone and making sure that the services that we provide, whether it's at the hospital, it's police, it's at the courts, or it's us, that we make sure it's accessible to everyone.
And I'm not an expert in this area either, and I don't have the latest data memorized, but even just thinking about how this pandemic has impacted women in different ways than men, and how so many women have had to quit their jobs to stay at home with their children. And so imagine like if you have abuse going on and now you've quit your job and you're just at home with your kids and your abuser, or, you know, I just think the dynamics have changed so much and added so much stress, which is going to have long-term impact on sort of the health of our communities across the country once we get out of this pandemic.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I agree, yes.
So this is kind of like, we've been touching on this and making sure, but what can agencies such as DAP, the Domestic Abuse Project, and there is a domestic violence agency in every county of Pennsylvania. So agencies like ours, what can we do to make sure that the services that we provide are accessible and are also, inclusive of every community?
Yeah, so it made me really excited to hear that you have some of these relationships with other agencies and that you have ways to offer translation services if there are language barriers. Because I think cultural competency and being able to provide these services and support in a cultural competent way is really important. And I'll just give you a quick example. 2 years ago, the South Asian Bar Association held a service event in Atlanta to help a number of different South Asian organizations, and one of them was Raksha. And Raksha means protection in many South Asian languages. And it's a nonprofit in Georgia that's dedicated to promoting stronger and healthier South Asian communities through support services, education, and advocacy. And so as one part of this service event that we had planned, we put together spice packets for Raksha's food pantry. And as we were putting together those packets, a representative from Raksha shared with us, why they even have a food pantry. And she shared a story of early in her time at the organization where she was asked to take a survivor who had just left an abusive home to the grocery store to get groceries. And when they got to the Walmart, the survivor just sort of stopped in her tracks. She stared, she didn't know what to do. The store was so big, she didn't know how she was going to find the Indian ingredients that she needed to help her cook the foods that she knew and was comfortable cooking, right? So nothing looked familiar to her, and she ended up leaving without anything, okay?
Wow.
And ultimately, because of experiences like that, Raksha decided to launch its own food pantry that has South Asian spices and lentils and rice and the teas that we like to drink in our community. And it's just to allow survivors to have access to these things that are comforting to them, right? And now, in addition to food, they also carry toiletries, feminine hygiene products, toys and books for children. And so it's a place that they can come to access the things that are familiar to them. But it's also a way, it's all donated. So Raksha is able to give these things to these survivors who may not be able to pay for them otherwise as well. So it's really served an important benefit. But here we had a South Asian organization that wasn't really anticipating even the needs of the South Asian survivors. And so they learned as they go. And I think with cultural competency, that's the name of the game, right? We're always learning. We're always seeing what matches the needs of the people who need our support. So I think that's really important. You did touch on sort of language and being able to provide resources in different languages. And that's really important in the South Asian community, because each of those countries I mentioned that make up the term South Asian have their own languages, but even within those countries, like India has a bazillion languages. I don't even know how many languages they have, right?
Yeah.
And so it becomes, a real issue to be able to provide support in all of those different languages. And then I want to touch on collaboration. I think sometimes organizations think that they have to take this all on themselves, and it doesn't sound like DAP is in that position at all, but I think it's important to know that as we work in this space where we're taking minimal resources, minimal dollars, and trying to make maximum impact, that collaborating is really important, and sharing experiences and lessons learned are just as important as well. So I sit on the board of the South Asian Bar Association Foundation. And one of the events we launched during the pandemic was what we call grantee roundtables. And so every year we give out grants to organizations that are working within the South Asian community. And we decided to bring those organizations that we've given awards to over the years together to talk about key issues. So we've held 2 roundtables, one on domestic violence and one on immigration. And both of them have been so successful in terms of the feedback we've received from these organizations, because they now have resources at other organizations similar to theirs across the country that they didn't have before these conversations. And so even just having these conversations, sharing learning, sharing experiences, finding ways to convene groups, I think can be so important and beneficial.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think, at DAP, we also know we're not trying to limit anyone when they come to us, and understand that we can't do everything. We've all come from different experiences. And while there's still experiences that none of us have had that our clients and survivors have experienced. So we have to make sure that the information that we go into our everyday is encompassing everyone. But we know that that's not possible if we just sit and just, talk to each other again and again. So yeah, collaboration is huge. And also, it's also fun to get to know what else is around. It's exciting to learn about other cultures and to see how learn about other people's experiences. So I think, it's great. Maybe people get scared because they don't want to seem as if it's a failure if they don't know everything, but we can't know everything. And learning should be something that's positive, and, making sure that I keep saying experiences, but making sure that the experience we have when we're learning is one that's positive and really encourages growth as well.
Agree.
Ania, would you like to wrap us up today?
Okay. Yeah. I just want to add my comment. I think
go ahead. Absolutely.
Really important. I do believe that we live in a society today where people seem to think that English and Spanish are the two languages in general. So I remember one time I was at the store and there was a lady, she was from a different country, and she was trying to say I don't understand that. And then someone advocated for her and she was like, well, you guys only have it in English and Spanish. It's only two languages. Do you know there's other languages in the world? And I was like, it really stopped and made me think oh wow, all I see is English and Spanish translations and most of the stores I go to. And it's what if somebody really is from a different country, comes here and they don't understand or can't read that? So it's it makes me think language, we need to really start taking accountability. Okay, other people exist. And I think that does a good job with that, especially with the translation hotline. Like Veronica said, we can assist with different languages, not just two. So I definitely agree with that. Yeah, I definitely agree.
Yeah.
All right. And Priya, we just have one last question. Is there any messages that you would like to leave for our listeners today?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing we need to be aware of as we start addressing domestic violence and gender-based violence more broadly is that we have to make it a priority and a public health issue. So violence was declared a public health issue in 1979. And yet it's a huge problem 42 years later. And so we have to start addressing it as a public health issue. And so that means that we all need to be working on this issue. We can't just leave it on the healthcare system. We can't leave it on organizations like DAP in the community that are providing support to survivors. I think it's important that we all sort of come together and play the role that we can each have. So for people who are listening, obviously you can learn more about domestic violence. And if you're listening, you're doing that right now, right? Listen to how it's impacting your community and other communities around you. You can also donate and volunteer at organizations like DAP and others in the community that are doing work to provide critical services to survivors. You can also speak up, raise awareness, or advocate for changes in the law. And I think last and most importantly is we can all play a role in creating safe spaces for survivors. When I ended my relationship, I was living by myself. My ex-fiance had just told me on the phone that he wished he would have killed me. And that was a day after he had drugged me across a parking lot by my hair. I told him I was done. I called off our wedding. And I called my older sister immediately and told her everything. That conversation, what had happened the night before, what had really been happening for months. And I was afraid that if I didn't call her immediately, I'd change my mind and it would just keep continuing. But I was also really afraid because I had no idea what she was going to say, right? So I had all of this stuff that we've talked about my community and my culture in the back of my mind and calling off a wedding. And thankfully, she said, pack your bags, I'm coming to get you. And then I had to call my parents, and they had actually just landed in India to shop for my wedding. And so I was scared to tell them. And I really don't remember much of the conversation other than that my mom ended the call by saying that she loved me, that they were both proud of me, and that I didn't need to worry about anything else. And then they got on the next flight back and moved in with me for the month that they were supposed to be in India. And so when they had to go back to work, my younger sister moved in with me, and she stayed with me for 3 months. And so while there were so many people in my community that judged me, from the minute I decided to call off my relationship, I wasn't alone. And in addition to my family, who just are awesome, and I don't know how I got so lucky to deserve them, but I had and still have amazing friends who listen and support me. So I was so lucky to have this village. And I share this piece of my story because I think we all deserve to have this village. Absolutely. And I think that everyone who's listening should find a way to be that village that can listen and support and believe and create a safe space for those in your life that need it. So learning more, raising awareness, and being there to listen, support, and believe, that's really my last word. And I think it's how each of us can play a role at fighting domestic violence.
Well, thank you so much, Priya, for joining us today. Like, your information has been invaluable. We, can't thank you enough for spending the time with us. And for anyone listening, please know that you can always reach us at our 24/7 hotline. That number is 610-565-4590. You can call anytime, any day, and you can reach an advocate. We're also on all social media platforms at DAP Delco, where you can find information about our services, other services around in the agency, in the area, and, answer any questions. You can always reach out, ask about volunteering opportunities, like Priya mentioned, donation opportunities. All of that is on our social media. But thank you for joining. This is episode 4 of Relationships. Next week, we'll be talking about another, pop cultural event, and we're so excited, and we hope to see, everyone there. Thank you so much.
Yeah.